from Very Vague here, and in this video I'm going to be taking you through step by step how I create these anime style driving loops that I use a lot in my artwork. And typically how I've set these up in the past has been more of a manual process like I showed in my last tutorial. But now, thanks to geometry nodes, we can set this up in a much more dynamic and procedural fashion, whereby we'll be able to have everything building from just a single curve, like in these examples from my road generator pack. And I'll be showing you how we can streamline this even further so that we can make all our desired adjustments from these simple top level sliders here, controlling things like the size, speed, and count for each of our different elements we wish to add. As you'll see once we go under the hood of these setups, it can get a bit complicated to find things easily. But I assure you, it's actually really not as overwhelming as it looks, as most of these coloured groups are just copies of node setups that we're going to iteratively work our way through over the course of this video. So don't feel like you need prior knowledge of geometry nodes to watch this tutorial, as I'll be starting off super simple in just creating a basic circular road setup, so we can get our heads around some of the logic behind these setups first. So with that being said, let's begin by opening up Blender and starting a new project. So the first thing we'll want to do is pull open a new window and set this to our geometry node editor. Then, in order for us to start adding in nodes, we'll first need to assign an object a geometry nodes modifier. So for this, I'm just going to use the default cube, as it doesn't really matter what this object is, as it's just going to act as the controller or parent for our setup. Then I'm just going to press this pin icon here to make sure our node setup stays in our window even when we don't have our cube selected. Then what we'll want to create is a base path or curve that everything in our setup is going to stem from. So in this case, because we want this to be just a simple round looping road, we're going to come up here to our add rollout and under the curve tab, select circle. Then I'm going to scale this up using the shortcut S on our keyboard and rename it to something so we'll be able to easily identify that it's our base curve. So I just called this road circle. Now, in order for us to use this as an input in our geometry node setup, all we have to do is just drag this over from our outliner like so. And so the first thing we'll start off by creating is the actual road itself. And to do that, we're going to make use of the curve to mesh node, which we can search up using the shortcut Shift+A. And what this is going to allow us to do is to sweep a profile curve of our choosing along our base circle. And because I want my road to just be a flat line, we can make use of another node called the curve line node, which will just draw a straight line between two specified points, which if we now plug into the profile curve input, we can see it's extruding this default 1 meter line that we can then increase or decrease to adjust the size. And what we'll want to do is actually extrude this line in both directions so we can get this middle line here of our base circle to act as the center lane for our road. So in order to do this, we could manually enter in the start and end values so it's evenly extruding in both the positive and negative direction. But what's an easier method, and what will actually help us to make quick adjustments to the road later on, would be to come up here to our group input node and add in a new input node that we'll then be able to use to control the values for both directions simultaneously. And the great thing about this is any input we add to this we'll be able to access from the modifier tab of our cube controller, as you can see here. So we can go ahead and rename this to something like road width, so we'll know exactly what this slide is going to do when we adjust the values later on. So before we plug our new road width value into our curve line node, we're going to want to add in a combine XYZ node, as we'll only want this value to affect the X direction of our curve so it stays nice and flat. And then if we plug these in like so and adjust our slider, we'll now see that update accordingly. So to get this working on the other side of our road, we'll want to do the same thing, but this time add in a math node and then set this to multiply by -1 so that it will convert our value into the negative direction for our other side. And now we can see when we adjust our slider, we're getting our desired result of an even offset in both directions. So before we move on to our road lines or lanes, one important tip I'd recommend to keep your setup organized is to make use of frames, which will allow us to create these groups of nodes that we can then move around as one object and rename and color to our liking. As you'll find, once we start to copy some of these groups, it can get quite chaotic not having any reference for which nodes are controlling what. So with that being said, I just created this little group here for our road, which I then duplicated using the shortcut Shift-D for our road lines, as it'll pretty much be the exact same setup. But in order to make the thickness of the lines much thinner, we'll want to add in a new value for our group called road lines width, and then plug these into the same corresponding inputs as our first setup, along with the base curve to our curve to mesh node. And now to get this to show up in our viewport, we'll need to add in a join geometry node, so we can plug additional meshes into our output node like so. So now you'll see that our lane is showing up, but the problem we're going to get is that it's going to be directly overlapping or intersecting with our road. So to solve this, what I'm going to do is just add in a transform node for our curve input so we can move this up a tiny bit by adjusting the Z position here slightly. And now it should be sitting just on top of our road, which we'll be able to see a bit clearer if we change into the material preview mode here. And in order to give our objects some different materials, we can make use of the set material node, which we can then also add an input for in our group input. Again, just so it's easier to adjust all these parameters from our cube controller like so. And then with that set up, we're now going to want to create some outer lanes closer to the edges of our road. So for this, we'll first again copy over our main nodes here, which is everything but the set material node. And then add in another join geometry node so that we can plug all our lane objects into the one set material node to make things more streamlined. Now, in order to move our lane to the outer edge of the road, we're going to want to use a really handy node called the set position node, which will allow us to scale the size of our original curve in either direction based on its normal. So we can do this by first adding in a vector math node that we're then going to set to scale, before then adding in a normal node and plugging this into the vector itself. And now if we adjust this scale value, we can see we're able to position this appropriately. So that's great, but you'll notice if we come back here and adjust our original road width slider, that it doesn't update its offset from the edge of the road as we'd probably like it to. So in order to fix that, we can simply add in another math node, this time setting it to multiply, before then taking the input from our road width and plugging this into the scale value like so. And now if we adjust this value so it's back about where we want it, we'll now see that when we update the road width, that this is now actually taking that dimension into account and scaling itself alongside it, which is exactly what we're after. So then to create the inner edge lane for the road, we can now copy this group of nodes we just created and set the value to the inverse of what we just set, which in my case was about -18. So the final thing we might want to set up for our road lanes is giving them some dashed or broken lines. And probably the best method I've found to do this so far is by just cutting out some boxes along the normals of our curve. So to do this, what we'll want to do is first add in an instance on points node, before then adding in a curve to points node from our transform node that we used to raise our curve slightly. Then from here, we can add in a cube node, which we'll input as our instance object, so that this will then place our cubes at each of the dividing points along our curve. And to make sure these are following along the rotation of our curve, we'll want to connect this rotation output into our instance rotation like so. From here, we can adjust the size of the cubes to about the size we want the gap between our lines to be, which we can then cut out of our circle by using a mesh boolean node. Then we'll plug this into our join geometry node, replacing our existing circle. And now we should get that showing up as intended in our viewport. So from here, what we'll want to do is add some movement to the road. And probably the quickest and easiest way of doing that would be to just add some rotation keyframes on the actual curve itself. So if I were to just go in here and select our road circle from the outliner, we could then just come down here and adjust our rotation, and our whole geometry node setup should move along with it. And if it's not, what we'll want to make sure is that our object node is set to relative and not original, which means it'll update live alongside any changes we make to the transform of our object in the viewport, which you can now see working here. So now to add in our road movement, I'm going to put in a keyframe by pressing the shortcut I over our Z rotation at 0 degrees. And then for our second keyframe, we'll want to put this on the last frame of our timeline at 360 degrees. And set the interpolation mode for both of them to linear, so the speed of the animation will stay consistent. And what this is going to do is add exactly one full rotation over the duration of our timeline, which is what's going to give us our perfect seamless loop. As we'll see here once it gets to the end and repeats back to the start, we don't get any ugly frame skips happening. Next, we can move on to creating some barriers for the sides of our road. And this will again be a pretty similar setup to how our road lines are working. So I'm just going to copy this group of nodes controlling the inner lane and rename this frame to barriers. Then I'm going to delete our curve line setup, as what we're going to do this time is create a custom profile curve to sweep along it. So to create this profile curve, I'm going to add in a Bezier curve, so it takes on more of a bendy W profile like so. Then I'm going to rename it to something like barrier curve, before then dragging this into our geometry node setup and plugging it into the profile curve input. And now, once we've plugged this setup into the corresponding input and output nodes, we might end up with a result that is way out of scale or in the wrong direction. So to fix this, we can again just make use of the transform node, which will allow us to adjust the scale and rotation so it's more to our liking. Now to adjust the location of our barriers in relation to our road, we'll want to repeat the process we used earlier for scaling our lanes by hooking the first value on our scale by normal setup into the road width parameter, so that our barriers will adjust alongside the size of our road. Then we'll add another transform node in between our base curve and set position nodes, so we can move the height of this part of the barrier up a bit more. Now, to create the pylons or posts that are going to sit behind our barrier, we're going to want to add in a curve to points node, followed by an instance on points node. So we'll be able to position an object of our choosing along these divided points of our curve. So the object I'm going to add in is a cylinder that if we then plug into our instance input, followed by the joint geometry node, we'll now see showing up in our viewport. And as we can see, they're looking a bit chunky, so we can scale these down by adjusting their radius value, and then we can also choose to add more or less of these cylinders by adjusting the count slider on our curve to points node. So that's looking good, but we probably want to have these so that they're sitting slightly behind our barrier and not overlapping with it like they currently are. So again, we're just going to copy over this set position setup, followed by a transform node, and that's going to allow us to adjust both the height and offset of our posts relative to our main barrier. Then I just went ahead and added in a few more top level inputs to our group input node, so it'll be easier to adjust some of these parameters like the material and pole count later on. But it's really up to you here how many of these custom inputs you want to add in and for what they control. Following this, I then just once again copied over the nodes for our barrier setup and inverted some of the values so that we'd get it showing up on the other side as well. And so now that we've got the base elements of our procedural road set up and everything's looking good, it'll really be a case of just copying over our existing setups and repurposing them for the remaining elements we wish to add in. Like we can see here for the trees, where I just copied the exact setup of the poles we just created, but replaced it with this new input object. I then added in some basic randomization to achieve a more organic look by first adding in a rotate instances node, followed by a random value node, which I then also created for the scale as well. Next, I wanted to add in some streetlights. So I just went ahead and created a new collection for these, adding in a lamp pole object, followed by a spotlight. And then for the geometry node setup itself, this is again going to be similar to our previous groups, so I just copied this over and set it up. With the only difference this time being to just input the actual collection itself, instead of a single object like previously. And what this will do is basically pack everything that's in our collection and then place as a single instance along our specified points, which comes in super handy in cases like this where we're looking to combine different types of objects like meshes and lights. And you'll just want to again ensure the rotation from our curved points node is plugged directly into the rotation on our instances node, so we get these orienting with the curvature of our road. I then just adjusted the light properties so I was getting some nice fall off and shadows on my trees. Then for the last element I wanted to add in for our road, I wanted to make use of another collection here, filled with a bunch of these assorted roadside objects and signs. But this time, rather than keep these all together, I actually want to tell our geometry node setup to select from this group of objects at random and place separately along our points. So to do this, I'm first going to once again copy over our previous setup and then rename this to something like random objects. From here, all we need to do is update our collection node so that it's set to our new one we just created, and then just check these two boxes here for separate children and reset children, followed by also checking this option for pick instance on our instance on points node. And now we'll see we've got all our objects from our collection separated out and arrayed individually along our curve to points node. And then once we're happy with our overall road, we can move on to the fun part of actually setting up some of our render views and playing around with the lighting. So for me, I just decided to add in this very aesthetic evening HDRI, before then adding in a camera and trying to set up a composition that felt like it would show off our scene the best. Next, I wanted to add in a car to act as the sort of focal point for this shot. So my process for this usually relies on me having a certain car in mind that I'm looking to use, which in this case was this classic 1970s Porsche 911. Then from here, my go-to sites are usually 3D Warehouse and Sketchfab to check out if there's any existing 3D models of it available online. Which, when it comes to cars, there usually is, because yeah, people just really love modeling cars. And so I ended up finding this really amazing model by a guy called Carol Miklas, so big shout out to him, and I'll link that down below for anyone interested in using this one. Then I just imported this into Blender and started experimenting around with where to position it on our road. And because I decided to go for this super wide landscape shot, I found it worked best placing it off further in the distance here, so that it was kind of drawing us into the shot as it goes around this infinite bend. Then for the materials of the car, I just added in a simple glossy BSDF shader for the windows and a red emission shader for the tail lights. Then for the body, I wanted it to look more like a traditional two-tone anime shader. So to do this, we can just add in a glossy BSDF that we can then restrict to using only 2 colors through the use of a shader to RGB node along with a color ramp node. That if we then plug into a mix shader, we can use to control the difference in color between 2 RGB nodes acting as our shadows and reflections, like so. Next, I then added in a couple spotlights for our headlights, so we'd get some cool reflections on the trees. So now I'm pretty happy with how everything is looking overall, but I think one thing that's throwing it off a bit is the background, which is looking a bit too empty and photoreal for my liking. So to give this a more stylized look, what I'm going to do is first add in a simple plane that I'm then going to scale and position so that it's filling up our window here. Before then giving this a gradient and color ramp shader that I'm going to try and make look like a kind of dreamy evening sunset here. I then added in a couple more planes, which I subdivided and edited to resemble some scenic mountains in front of our sky. And then just added in some location keyframes, so these would move slowly from side to side in our animation. Then to complete the look, we're going to want to add in some line work. So for this, we'll just come down here into our freestyle properties and make sure this box is checked. And then I usually like to set this at about 0.5. And now we'll see if we hit the render image button, it'll then add in these lines over our render, which really helps to give it a bit of extra detail and achieve that more graphical anime style we're going for. Then to apply the finishing touches, I like to just come over into our compositing tab and add in a glare node so we get some nice bloom and glow around our highlights. And then yeah, that was pretty much it, guys. And obviously the great thing about having this in 3D is now we can just mess around with our camera and start taking some new views and play around with different compositions. So feel free to experiment applying this setup to different types of curves and using different input objects, as the possibilities here are pretty much endless with geometry nodes. In my case, I've already taken this and applied it to a few different setups in the past couple weeks, like you can see here with this more custom road example, where I just had everything stemming from this single curve with these buildings on the sides replacing our trees. And then this multi-lane road one here, where I also added in some basic traffic that changes based on the amount of lanes we subdivide or input. And as I mentioned earlier, these are now all available on my Gumroad in this road generator pack for anyone who might be interested. And it's also just a really great way of supporting the channel. So thanks for watching, guys. Get creative and have fun.
I was trying to be low key, man, that's just my hop in the back of the coupe, yeah, that big on top, that ride go on soon, they can't stop me,